Ambassador Bremer, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How much of an echo did you personally hear when the Iraqi army fled recently? How much of an echo did you hear from 2003?
Well, the situation in 2003 had some similarities because before I got to Iraq, effectively the Iraqi army had left the field. The Shia conscripts had all gone home. The problem we faced was whether we should recall that army. And this did not seem like a very good idea to me for both political and practical reasons. The most important political constraint was we would be forcing large numbers of Shia conscripts who hated the army to come back into the army and serve under officers, usually Sunni officers, sometimes Arab, sometimes Kurd, who had abused them and mistreated them. So, and the second political reason was that the Kurdish leaders at the time were very clear to me. They had heard rumors that we were going to recall the army, and they said, if you do that, we are going to take Kurdistan out of Iraq, which in 2003, I think, even as possible now, would broaden the war beyond the region of Iraq. So instead, we created a new army, and I think we had some success with that.
Okay, before we go on, let me backpedal a couple of steps to what you said. You said the Iraqi army at that time fled. Why? How do you explain it?
Well, I think you had a very imbalanced army. You had 300,000 conscripts and 415,000 officers. It was a very top-heavy army. And I think once the army saw which way the battle was going, don't forget the war took only 3 weeks, a lot of them said, we don't want to be involved in this. And they said we're going back to our villages and back to our farms. We don't want to be involved in this anymore. We might get killed.
Now, there were, as I'm certain you're aware, there were reports at the time that something happened that was tantamount to bribery being paid to many of those soldiers who fled by the CIA, for example. Does that change the way, if you think it's true, you look at what actually happened in 2003?
Well, I'm sure there were lots of reasons. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men here from all over the country, so there's no one answer to why they fled or why they went home. When I made my announcement about the Iraqi army, I said, and I paid respect to the fact that in Iraq's history, the last 100 years, the Iraqi army has played an important and often very useful role in defending the national territory. So our problem was how to create a new army, and our focus was on doing that. There was no army to disband. The mistake I made was using the verb to disband an army which effectively had already gone home.
So you are saying that you did not disband the army went home, it didn't have the stomach to fight. And I come back again and say that there are people who thought that the Iraqi army, at least parts of it, had the stomach to fight, did fight, was loyal to Saddam. Other parts of the army were bribed off the service to go home until they were recalled. What happened between when the army was disbanded, as it's sometimes described, and when some of it was recalled back, if you think it was recalled back?
Well, I can really only speak with direct knowledge about the 14 months I was there. There was only one effort to recall the army, to recall a unit of the former army, which was done by the US Marines in the Fallujah crisis of April 2004. They recalled an entire brigade from Saddam's army. By the way, without consultation with us, with the political leadership. It was a complete failure. The brigade was under Marine command. The Marines asked them to go in and help us bring stability to Fallujah, and they immediately went over, basically joined the extremists fighting us instead of helping us. So the one experience with actually recalling the army was a complete failure.
Now, before we go any further, when you go back and compare the state of the Iraqi army at that time not to what extent it was loyal to Saddam, but the composition of the
Right.
army with the current army that has
Right.
been formed under Nouri Al-Maliki. Where do you see the similarities? Where do you see the differences?
Well, it's important to understand what we did. We obviously knew that Iraq needed an army. So we decided to recruit a new army, and we made several important points. We said that any officer from the former army up to the level of colonel was welcome to come and apply for a position in the new army. All the officers, except for the very top generals of the old army, were given a pension which was intentionally set at a substantially higher level than they would have gotten if they'd been pensioned under Saddam Hussein. So we gave them money. Those pensions are still being paid to this day. That was now 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And by the time I left Iraq 14 months later, it was still a small army. I think we had only 3 brigades at that time. But 75% of the officers and non-commissioned officers in the new army were from the old army. We had welcomed them in. We vetted them to be sure that they were okay and brought them in. The army that was then built by the with American training was an effective army. That army defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq by the end of 2008 or 2009. Then the next question is, well, why did it collapse in Mosul and Tikrit? And I think the answer largely goes to the fact that as part of his efforts to create a more authoritarian government, Nouri Al-Maliki, after our troops left in 2011, basically started purging many of those trained officers, even down to the battalion level in the Iraqi army. And by the way, he did the same thing with the Iraqi intelligence service, which we had built up also starting in 2003 and 2004. Anybody who knows about the military knows that the unit commander is the key to the fighting capability of the unit. So I can imagine some members of the new Iraqi army sitting in Mosul and finding themselves being commanded by somebody whose main qualifications for the office were that they were supporters of Nouri Al-Maliki, not that they had military experience. Well, that's not a way to fight a war.
But to go back to what you said, that the Iraqi army defeated Al-Qaeda, to use your own words. Now, would you go so far as to make that a little bit more nuanced and say that Iraq's United States-led army defeated Al-Qaeda at that time? When the US forces moved out, the army, in the eyes of many critics of Nouri Al-Maliki, had become so sectarian, it was predictable that what happened would happen.
Well, I would say it was not a US-led Iraqi army, it was a US-trained Iraqi army that defeated Al-Qaeda in 2008, 2009. And I agree. I think one of the key elements of the current situation we're seeing is the decision not to have any American troops after 2011, which was interpreted by Nouri Al-Maliki as requiring him, in his own mind, to purge the army, to issue an arrest warrant for his vice president, to become more contentious with the Kurds over the oil revenues, and so forth, basically moving towards a much more sectarian-based government. That was certainly not our idea when I was there, and it was not in America's interest.
Now, you said a little while ago that the Iraqi army had been known for over 100 years for defending their country. It had become a symbol of Iraqi identity. Before you disbanded it, whatever verb you choose to use, did you stop to think about the psychological impact dissolving the army of a nation would have on that nation?
Well, we didn't think of it in terms of dissolving it because it wasn't there. A month before I got to Iraq, the Pentagon's military commander on the ground told people in Washington, there is not a single unit of the Iraqi army standing at arms anywhere in the country. So in our discussions, it wasn't a question of whether we were going to dissolve an institution. The institution, the verb the Pentagon used was self-demobilized. There was no Iraqi army.
Did you buy that?
It was certainly my observation that this looked accurate. Now, I was not traveling around the country to check each army barracks. But we did know, for example, that all of the army barracks had been completely looted, right down to the base bricks. People, when they left, had taken the sinks and the toilets and the windows and the doors. I mean, basically, there was no army.
But if there was no army, how come there was later on a resistance which many people, including yourself, did concede that it was composed of former army people?
Well,
if they demobilized.
Analyzing the situation in 2003 and 2004, it's important to distinguish where the violence was coming from. Most of the violence, the big car bombs, the suicide bombs, as it turned out, were Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Mossab Zarqawi. We didn't know that in the summer and fall of 2003. It wasn't until we intercepted a letter from Zarqawi in January of 2004 that we had a picture of what his strategy was. And it was very clear. He said to Osama bin Laden, we're going to start a civil war here by killing Shia civilians indiscriminately and hope that that then provokes a Shia reaction against the Sunnis, and we'll have a civil war and we can establish a caliphate. By the way, it's the same strategy that ISIS pursues these days, or Daesh pursues these days.
But, I mean, what you're saying now presupposes that every Iraqi in Iraq at that time did accept the invasion of 2003 as salvation. We know there were a lot of Iraqis who rejected the invasion of 2003 and later on showed themselves to be very willing to fight against the Americans.
Look, I don't mean to imply that I think none of the former Army officers took up arms against the United States. I'm sure they did. I've never seen any coherent study or analytical study of it, but I'm sure that's the case. What I am saying is that the people who took up arms against us took up arms not because they weren't being paid. They had a very handsome pension. There was nothing constraining them from starting businesses, as Iraqis were doing all over the country. They took up arms because they didn't want to see representative government. So that is the way I look back on it. I believe it was, in fact, the only decision that we could make was to create a new army.
But, I mean, in your thinking back at that time, was there any space for the possibility that some of those fighting the occupation in 2003 were actually Iraqis who just, they may have hated Saddam Hussein, but they loved their country?
Of course. Look, if we step back and ask ourselves what happened in 2003, what happened was, by taking Saddam Hussein out of power, we had overturned the Sunni domination of Mesopotamia that had been there for 1,000 years. It was, in effect, a major political revolution. Political revolutions are hard on people, and they take a very long time to restabilize. We are still in the restabilization phase now, which I hope we get through. So, of course, we understood there would be people who disliked it, but those people who say that, quote, disbanding the army created the insurgency have never produced any evidence of that. Again, I don't dispute that some of these people went and joined the resistance, but to argue that that is what caused the resistance, I think, is simply not proven.
And, you know, just to bring this part of it full circle, we've been hearing in recent days that many of the people who have actually been fighting Nouri Al-Maliki's army are former members of the former army in Iraq. And therefore, I ask you, to what extent do you think that what has happened in recent days harks back, its roots hark back to some of the decisions that you took when you were administrator in Iraq?
Well, you know, if there are people from the former army now serving in the Iraqi army, that's what our policy was. As I said, we welcomed anybody up to the level of colonel in the old, and some of them got promoted to brigadiers while I was there, and obviously have been promoted above brigadier since. So some of them are undoubtedly part of the old army. That was our plan. That's not a surprise. I believe that the answer to why it collapsed as quickly as it collapsed has more to do with the purging of American trained officers. But that's my view.
But I didn't mean the people who were inside the army that has been set up under Nouri Al-Maliki. I mean, some of the people fighting that army in Mosul and elsewhere are reportedly members of the former army of Iraq.
Well, that's possible. As I said, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was not just the end of a tyrant, it was the end of an era. And we are in the decade after the end of an era of the power structure that had been there for 1,000 years. And there are still, one of the problems on this point that we had was trying to explain to everybody in Iraq, whether they were Shia or Sunnis or Kurds, that representative democracy means majority rule, but it also means respect for minority rights. And the Shia had to learn the respect for minority rights. The Sunnis had to learn that majority rule means you have to win elections. You remember the Sunnis didn't even take part in the first elections, which was, I think they recognized a tactical mistake. So we're still dealing with the question of how difficult it is to pick up after such a political revolution.
I'd like to talk a little bit more later on about the decision to disband the Iraqi army, but you mentioned representative government. How convinced were you in your heart of hearts that invading Iraq in 2003 was not only necessary, but that you had the means and the tools, you meaning the Bush administration, to actually carry it out successfully?
Well, I was confident we could carry it out. I did tell the American government, and I've written about it, that I thought it was going to take time, simply because my study of history and my knowledge of recent conflicts in the Balkans and elsewhere suggested that you don't move from dictatorship to democracy overnight. So it has been certainly difficult. We had additional problems on the ground. We didn't have enough people, either military or civilian, as I have said before. But I think given the tools we were given, we actually did rather well in the 14 months I was there.
But what convinced you, or what led you to believe that Iraqis were itching for the Americans to bring them democracy, representative or otherwise?
Well, it was pretty obvious. I mean, basically, all the Iraqis that I met, and I admit I don't speak Arabic, so I can't hold myself out as an expert, but all of the Iraqis that my colleagues who do speak Arabic and were excellent, all of them said they wanted democracy. And I guess the major...
they wanted democracy, but not military invasion.
Well, they had tried for 3 decades to get rid of the Ba'ath Party on their own. And I remember an Iraqi leader saying to me, "You did in 3 weeks what we tried unsuccessfully to do in 3 decades." The turnout in the Iraqi elections, the percent of voters voting, has been higher than in any American presidential elections for the last 140 years. The idea that we were somehow forcing democracy or representative government on the Iraqis simply has no basis. In fact, all you have to look at the Iraqis who took their lives in their hands in the elections where the Al-Qaeda said, "You vote, you die," and the pictures of all those women with their purple fingers saying, "I voted, I'm proud to have voted."
That's
that
fine.
Tells you all you need to know about
That's
the
fine.
Iraqis.
I understand that. But there's also a contradiction in saying, "I'm going to punch into you militarily and give you democracy." I mean, to a lot of there may have been a lot of Iraqis who agreed with you. I know there are a lot of other Iraqis who thought that the two were mutually exclusive, to punch in militarily and then say here's democracy. It doesn't work that way, they say.
Well, all I can say is they tried the alternatives for 3 decades and it didn't work. You could argue they tried the decades since the British occupation in the 1920s. They didn't come up with democracy on their own.
Well, do you think they have democracy now?
Absolutely.
How?
It is a very imperfect, weak, new democracy. Well, they've had 6 elections since I left Iraq. They've all been free elections. I'm sure there have been irregularities. There are irregularities in Chicago elections, after all. But Nouri Al-Maliki, for all of his faults, is a democratically elected leader. His party even won the third elections just now in April. It's a democracy.
Well, Bashar al-Assad has been re-elected democratically,
but there's
according
no
to him and his
There's
his
no
supporters.
comparison. Bashar al-Assad is in the Soviet model where they report that he won 99.8% of the elections.
But
Nouri Al-Maliki didn't do quite that well.
Okay, but if you're saying that there is democracy in Iraq, and then you say at the same time that the army, led by the person who was supposed to have been elected democratically, was routed by Daesh or whoever it was in Mosul and other parts of Iraq, that doesn't say a great deal of positive things for Iraqi democracy then.
No democracy is perfect. Iraq is in the situation of trying to incubate a new democracy. This is never easy. If you study history, you can see examples all over the place. If you start with the French Revolution and think how long it took the French to get from the revolution of killing the king to actually a democracy, in fact, it was measured in decades. So the fact that it's an imperfect democracy should not surprise anybody. And I think the prime minister has substantial responsibility for the problems, as I mentioned. The purging of the intelligence service, the purging of the military, the American trained military, weakened both of those institutions and made them much more vulnerable to this blitz attack by Daesh.
Okay, now here's what many people will say. They will say, Ambassador Bremer is saying that there is democracy in Iraq, and one piece of evidence is that every now and then you see Iraqis holding up their fingers with voting ink on the tips of their fingers. But they will also say Iraq since 2003, not only has the state been pulverized, the human cost, not just for Americans losing 4,500 men and women, for Iraqis, you know, the estimates up to sometimes reach up into 600,000 Iraqis. You think that was still worth it?
Look, I spent more than a year in Iraq. People who worked for me died there. I know a lot of soldiers whose families where the soldiers died, and I've spent a lot of time with wounded warriors. I feel the same kind of emotional heartbreak that Iraqis must feel looking at what happened. If you take the camera back and ask yourself, are Iraqis better off today than they were under Saddam Hussein? I would say an unqualified yes. Unqualified.
Based on what?
Well, take your metric. Start with economic ones. Per capita income today is 6 times what it was when I got there. Electricity production is twice what it was. Infant mortality has dropped. Today, 80% of Iraqis have access to potable water. Under Saddam, it was 3%. You can go on down. Foreign direct investment is up 5 times from what it was. Bank deposits are up 24-fold. People have access, 23 million Iraqis have cell phones. There were none. You can go right down through all of those economic or measurements. You can also look at the political side. Iraq has today the most liberal constitution anywhere in the Arab world. Its constitutions are pieces of paper. You can tear them up and throw them away, and Al-Maliki has certainly pushed at the edges. But they have the constitution. They have had the elections. There have been far too many casualties in the last decade. I don't deny that, although they are still far less than they were under Saddam Hussein.
Well, I wanted to come back on that. I mean, there are a lot of Iraqis who will agree with you to the extent that you say that Saddam was a criminal. Many of them will say yes.
He was a monster. He was not a criminal. He was a monster.
But a lot of them would say at the time of Saddam Hussein, you could actually walk out safely on the streets of Baghdad. Not just not walk out in fear, not only for your pocket, fear of your life, bombings, the kind of gruesome killings between the Shia and the Sunnis that we have seen since 2003. Had never been seen under Saddam. So that's the opposite metric.
Yes. This is an argument which political scientists love to have, which is Is stability better than freedom?
No, but
Because
sorry, the people who say this are ordinary Iraqis who've been afflicted by
No,
these things,
I
not
understand
political
that.
scientists.
I understand, but there is a theoretical question, which is a government which offers stability, and by the way, under Saddam Hussein, you were certainly free to go out on the streets, but you better keep your mouth shut.
I tell you, isn't it the same for under Nouri Al-Maliki in many instances?
Not as it was under Saddam
His
Hussein.
opponents disappear, they've been shut out, they've been shot
Look,
at.
I'm not here to make the case for Nouri Al-Maliki. I'm simply saying, despite his flaws, he is no Saddam Hussein. Absolutely no comparison with. You know, I must have met 10,000 Iraqis more during my time in Iraq. I never met an Iraqi, not one, who hadn't had a relative killed or tortured by Saddam Hussein or his cronies. No Iraqi needs to be reminded of how pervasive the terror was under Saddam Hussein. Now, dictators can always impose stability. And we had dictators in Europe during the Second World War. Mussolini, for example, was famous for making the trains run on time. Adolf Hitler built autobahns that people could drive on. Saddam Hussein's Iraq was stable, but it was basically a terror house. So I will continue to say and believe that the Iraqis are better off today. We'll see how the situation develops than they were under Saddam.
I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question. If you look at the Arab world today, take Egypt, for example. Egyptians have had 3 years of political chaos,
right,
and instability. In the end, large segments of Egyptian society, they said, okay, if what it takes to bring back stability is to bring a military man, let's do it. Forget democracy for a while. Iraqis have sustained over 10 years of chaos and instability, with a death roll that the death roll in Egypt doesn't even begin to compare to it, but you still say that's okay, Iraq is a democracy.
I don't say it's okay. I never said it was okay. First of all, Sisi he's actually an elected leader.
Right.
So he's also democratic. I don't say it's okay. That wasn't your question. Your question was, are they better off than they were under Saddam? And I would say, yes, they are. I'm sure some Iraqis will disagree with me, but that's my view.
Now, we've only got a couple of minutes in this segment. So you mentioned the French Revolution, and I wanted to ask you, the French writer, philosopher, diplomat, Chateaubriand said something very interesting. He said that ambition, when you don't have the means to carry it out, becomes a crime. Do you think that the ambition to introduce democracy to Iraq beginning in 2003, you as the Bush administration had the means to carry it out, or do you think it turned at the end of the day into crime, whether by what the Bush administration did or by what Iraqis did?
No, I don't think it was crime. I'm been pretty clear for the last decade that I thought we did not have the means we needed, both on the civilian side and more importantly on the military side, until Bush very courageously did the surge in 2006 and 2007. And that certainly constrained us. I also think, in retrospect, that it was difficult to do everything we tried to do in 14 months. I think it probably takes longer than that, as we've seen since then.
Take us back to the thought process here in DC, the dynamics of the relationship between you and Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, George Bush at that time, when it came to that fateful decision to disband the Iraqi army.
The discussions about the army actually started a month before I came back into government. I was a businessman, and they were conducted by a fellow who became my advisor on national security matters, Walt Slocum. Slocum had been the number 3 man in the Pentagon under the Clinton administration. So he was a Democrat, he was from the other party, very able man. He began discussions with the senior people in the Pentagon, both the military, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Mr. Wolfowitz, who was the deputy secretary, in early April, right after the fall of Baghdad. At which point the question was, do we recall the army, or do we build an army from the bottom up. Slocum worked with them again before I came back into government, and they had reached the conclusion that they would have to create a new army. He briefed the secretary.
Based on what, by the way, that they said?
Based on a piece of paper they had together.
No, but what was the logic behind building up from scratch?
Well, the logic was there was no choice. There was no army unless we were going to recall it.
Was that your contacts that you provided to them?
No, I wasn't even in the government at this point. I was a businessman. I was happily enjoying a much safer life somewhere else. No, I was not even involved. By the time I came in, that discussion had essentially been finished, except that Slocum wanted to brief our British allies. So he went to London on the 13th of May, the day after I arrived in Baghdad, to discuss it with the British government. Again, they had no objections and made no qualifications to the thing. I briefed the president on it, first in a letter about 2 weeks later, and then in a televised meeting of the National Security Council.
Do you remember exactly what you said to him?
I don't have my notes with me. I told him we were going to create a new army, and he agreed. By the way, the entire National Security Council was at that meeting in Washington. I was in Baghdad, Rumsfeld, Secretary Powell, Dr. Rice, and so forth. So no one raised any objections, let me put it that way.
Okay, but so you're saying that decision had been made prior to even...
No, there was no decision. There was not a decision until the president approved it, which I think was on May 23rd, if I remember correctly.
And you were 100% for it, 50% for it? Did you have any reservations? How did it work?
I was for it. I was essentially 100% for it on the basis of the consultations that Slocum had had with people in the U.S. government already by that time for 6 weeks, and with the British, our allies. So, and I knew from the discussions that I by then had had with the Kurdish leaders that we faced the possibility of a dissolution of Iraq. Don't forget that the other thing that was in our minds was that Grand Ayatollah Sistani had asked the Shia to cooperate with the occupation. If you take the Shia, who are 80% of the population, and the Kurds, who are whatever, 15, nobody knows exactly percent, the majority of the Iraqi people, or 60% and 20%, the majority of the Iraqi people were cooperating with the occupation at that time. And some of the Shia leaders were telling us, look, the Republican Guard was the instrument of repression. You remember they put down the Shia uprising in 1991. The Republican Guards and the army had conducted a campaign of genocide against the Kurds, including using chemical weapons in Halabja in 1988. So two very large segments of the Iraqi population were very clear about the problems. So it wasn't that I was enthusiastic or not enthusiastic. We had to face the reality. There was no army. Iraq would need an army, so we had to build a new one.
By the way, when you talk about these percentages were put forth based on what? There was no
nobody
census.
knew. Yeah, nobody knew. There had not. It was one of the problems with the political, how we could get the politics going, because there had been no reliable census since 1957.
Right.
So in almost 40 years.
So who tossed these percentages out there?
The Shia said there were 60% of the population. Sometimes they said 70. The Kurds said they were 30 or 40. The Sunnis said they were a majority. I finally said to them all, look, it adds up to 140%. It can't be true. We basically don't know. We knew the Shia. Well, I said to them all, as we talked about the political structure, I said, I don't know about all those percentages, but I'll tell you one thing I know for sure. Women are a majority in this country. And I looked at them and I said, where are the women among the people who want to talk to us about the new political structure? And they couldn't produce any. So we went out and found some women to talk to.
But that's fine. But that raises the question. I mean, if you actually carry out an invasion to bring democracy to the Iraqis, as you said, you don't have any of the factual stuff that you need. You don't have the percentages. You're basically calling these percentages on a whim, and you're basing your decisions to shape the future of a country on a whim.
No, first of all, it had nothing to do with a whim. And nor did,
60%,
nor did the percentages have anything to do with the movement towards democracy. Democracy is everybody goes on their own, doesn't matter if they're Shia, Sunnis, Christians, Turkmen, and they vote.
No, but if you're saying
there was no carve up
no, but if
during the elections.
But if you're saying the Shia are a majority, and therefore the switch of power from the Sunnis to the Shia is going to be made from a minority to a majority, that is making a fateful decision about the future of a country based on a whim.
And the choice was what? The choice was simply to ignore the question?
Well, do you think
we used whatever figures there were. There were figures in the CIA country handbook that gave us what they thought the population distribution was, as they do for every country in the world every year. You can always go there, it's online, you can go look. But it may or may not be right. And the choice is what?
But the choice would have been, when it came to invading the country in 2003, to have thought about these things before the invasion, or not to have conducted the invasion at all.
They thought of no invasion because we didn't know what the population distribution was?
But I mean, it seems to me that if you're talking about it,
that's the reason we wouldn't go in, because we couldn't be precise about the number of Shias and Sunnis and Kurds?
If you're saying that
that's not a serious question.
If you're saying that you're taking democracy to the Iraqis.
No, we said representative government.
Representative government to the Iraqis. And you don't have any figures about how many Sunnis...
We had figures.
Well, you said you didn't have those figures based on a census. You decided these are the figures we're going to act along.
Excuse me. Look, you're talking to somebody who had a practical problem, which was what to do. When Bush made the decision to invade and then decided we weren't just going to turn over to some colonel somewhere and go home, we wanted to help them go to representative government. We had to find a program on how to make that happen. In fact, in the Future of Iraq study, which took place for a whole year before the invasion, conducted by the State Department, there were lots of discussions about how to move to democracy. We tried our best to follow those recommendations. The percentage and numbers of Shia and Sunnis was not a guiding factor. The guiding factor was, how do you get forward to some kind of an election, some kind of a process where the Iraqis get to choose their government for the first time in history.
Now, when you were carrying out these policies, how much of these policies were Ambassador Paul Bremer, and how much of them were Donald Rumsfeld or the vice president or even the president himself?
Well, it would depend on which policy you're talking about. And there was a constant interaction. I spoke to Secretary Rumsfeld almost daily, sometimes more than once a day, during those first 6 or 7 months. I spoke to the president regularly. There was a constant back and forth by telegram and by telephone. We had to make a lot of decisions on our own in Baghdad, but the big decisions, how to move to representative government, how to form the interim Iraqi government, what to do about the army, de-Baathification, those were all decisions that were made basically with Washington.
Did you feel, when those decisions were reached, did you feel that the people who made them in DC knew what they were talking about when it came to Iraq, the history of Iraq, the realities, either military or political, in Iraq?
Well, I think they knew, I think basically they were not uninformed decisions. I think they knew as much as they could. These are busy people. I mean, the president in particular had a lot of other things going on, although this was one of the most important things, obviously. Same with the Secretary of Defense. But I think there was quite a lot of expertise in the U.S. government, which we were able to draw on. We had 3,000 people working in the Coalition Provisional Authority from 25 different countries, many of them experts on Iraq, an even greater number of them fluent Arabic speakers with expertise in the region. So it's not as if we were a bunch of teenagers just on a lark. We took it pretty seriously.
But the appointment by President Bush, which named you as administrator of Iraq at that time, did it tie you much more to Rumsfeld than it did to Powell, or tied you to both of them equally? How did it work?
Well, that's a very interesting question that gets into the American system. No, it explicitly said that I was to report to the president, but through Rumsfeld. Now, in most all ambassadors, and I had been an ambassador before under a different president, ambassadors' normal chain of command is through the Secretary of State. I was reporting through the Secretary of Defense. Why? Actually, I think in retrospect it was the right decision for two reasons. One, because anything like an occupation, and we hadn't done this for 60 years, an occupation is going to involve a lot of political and military discussions and frictions. If you put the civilian, and no civilian can be in our military chain of command by law. So unless you had a general, the civilian was going to be in charge in Iraq. If the civilian reported through, in the normal way, through the Secretary of State, and the military reported through their chain of command, the Secretary of Defense, it meant that all of the disagreements went all the way up to the president automatically. The president, I think, he was a former businessman, felt it was better to delegate and push these things down a bit. So he put the civilian in a unique situation under in the place where it's also under the military chain of command. So Rumsfeld had both chains of command reporting to him. Mm-hmm. That's how it was set up.
So things that went right or things that went wrong while you were there in Iraq, how much of the blame is apportioned to you personally? How much of it should be apportioned to Rumsfeld, since given what you just said about him?
I take responsibility for anything I did because that was my responsibility. I don't get into the blame game. I made mistakes, particularly on the implementation of debathification, and I'm sure I made other ones.
Where was his rights or wrongs in this context?
I have said in my book and other places, that I thought the military, for whom Rumsfeld was primarily responsible, did not adequately plan for the post-conflict period. That is, for the period after what they call the kinetic phase of the war was over. We didn't have enough troops. They didn't have the right rules of engagement. And most importantly, they didn't have the right strategy. They didn't have a counterinsurgency strategy. Those things were not fixed until 2006, the end of 2006, long after I left. And those problems really belong in the Department of Defense, both the civilian and military side.
Is that dereliction of duty, do you think, or it was just not enough knowledge?
No, I think that goes too far. It wasn't, certainly not intentional. It wasn't dereliction of duty. It was just not part of the pre-war planning.
And given the amount of damage that it did to Iraqis and to Americans in Iraq, do you think that somebody should be held accountable for that, or you think, like Rumsfeld used to say, things happen?
Well, I'm a historian by training. I've studied an awful lot of conflicts, and I've been involved in one. One of the rules of thumb is that the plans that are made very rarely bear much relationship to what you actually face on the ground, whether it's a military operation or, in this case, a civilian occupation. So I think one should be somewhat sympathetic to the problem of the planners. The planners had made assumptions in the period from January to March of 2003 about the kind of situation they would face on the ground after the war. Again, I was not involved in this, but I know from what happened. And their assumptions then lead to the plans. That's how you do planning. The assumptions, as it turned out, were wrong. Basically, they assumed the situation after the war in 2003 would be exactly like the situation in 1991. You know, there's this saying, generals always plan for the last war. Well, it turned out the civilians planned for the last war, too.
But the thing is that when you make a mistake, nobody gets hurt. Then you turn around and you say, I apologize, I admit my mistakes, you move on. When you make mistakes and there's colossal loss of life and the destruction of the state, you can hardly just say, sorry guys, I made a mistake, I'll do better next time.
So what should I do, commit hara-kiri like a Japanese diplomat?
No, but I'm asking you, do you think that somebody ought to be held accountable?
Well, I think probably the
Republican, on the American side or the Iraqi side?
The Republican Party was held accountable in the election of 2008, if you want to look for a place. Sure. The accountability in democracy is, you lose an election, which is what the Republicans managed to do in 2008.
But in terms of legality and in terms of the judiciary, that's
I'm
the
not a
kind of
lawyer.
that's the kind of
I'm not a lawyer.
holding to account I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a view on that.
Okay. To end with the recent developments in Iraq, what lesson have they brought home to you about the decision by President Barack Obama to actually withdraw the U.S. Combat troops from Iraq?
Well, I think the withdrawal was a mistake. I said so at the time, and unfortunately, in this case, I was right. What happened was Nouri Al-Maliki took it as a signal of disinterest by America and giving him a freer range to establish a much more authoritarian, sectarian government, firing the officers in the army, purging the people in the intelligence community, firing the guy in charge of the electoral commission, disbanding the ombudsman, the independent person to whom you could play. All of these things, and particularly going after the Sunnis, arrest warrant for his vice president. All of these things contributed, really not just in the last few weeks, but if you go back a couple of years, to a progressive move towards a more authoritarian government under Prime Minister Al-Maliki. So I think it was a mistake to withdraw our forces. I think it has broader implications in the region and indeed in the world.
So finally, we only have 1 minute. You say that you took, or the intention was to take democracy to Iraq. Is it safe to say that even putting aside the destruction of the Iraqi state and the colossal loss of life, both on the Iraqi side and the American side, this is an attempt that at the end of the day led to authoritarianism? You just described Nouri Al-Maliki as an authoritarian prime minister.
It certainly has led to that as we speak today. Now, the situation is evolving there. We'll see how it develops in the future. I think it's very important to note that Grand Ayatollah Sistani has, I think, played a helpful role in the statement he recently made, calling for a more broad-based government to bring new horizons of hope to the Iraqi people. I think that's a very helpful statement, and it's one that I hope we can, in our way, help build on.
Ambassador Bremer, thank you very much.
Thank you.